Greetings and welcome to Strategic Planning and Forecasting, LDRS 341 in Humboldt State. My name is Renato Almanzor. Actually, my full name is Dr. Renato Patrick Insiong Inamagan Almanzor Jr., and it's fine if you call me Renato. And I share that with you because I bring all of who I am with me, just as it's my assumption that you bring all of who you are with you. And my teaching style and education style really requires that we bring all of who we are into the spaces of learning. And so I hope that you feel free to draw from your experience, as well as know that I'll be drawing from my experience even beyond academia, right? So I think a lot of learning for me has really been about understanding what my commitment is to social change in particular, and that it comes also from a commitment to individual and collective learning and practicing equitable ways of being. And so for this course, I will draw from all of that to be able to move through individual, relational, organizational learning and asking a question all along the way around what matters. And for me, what matters is that I'm really about social change. I do a lot of work in the community now. I'm the executive director of East Oakland Building Healthy Communities. I've been a professor for a number of years, off and on as a core as well as an adjunct in a lot of different places. My background is also in consulting and leadership development, capacity building specifically, and I'm really excited that this is my second time teaching this course. In this course, I tend to set up everything as a cycle of inquiry. In this course in particular, we'll be moving towards answering three essential questions. Why is strategic planning important? How should leaders go through the process of strategic planning? And what is the ultimate value of strategic planning and forecasting? I've set up this course drawing from other faculty and talking with my colleagues specifically around how does this fit within your overall leadership studies program. So I will be referring to courses that you've taken as well as courses that you will be taking, so that you can notice how this is located within an entire curriculum. I'll also be pulling from my almost 20 years of consulting and coaching leaders through strategic planning processes. And a little later, I'll actually post a couple of strategic plans that I've worked on. One that was a $125,000 gig, and another that was $25,000, and another that was actually with a group of grad students that I managed when I was on the board of a small $1 million organization. I was on the board and I was also a professor at the same time, so I worked with my colleague to get that going. And I'm in the process now of working with other organizations on the strategic and succession planning processes, where I'm using grad students from all across the Bay Area. But for me, really, this course is going to talk in four spaces, right? What does it mean to truly lead strategically? What are the levels of strategy we need to consider? What does it really mean to do a stakeholders and SWOT analysis? And what will it take then to lead and manage change? Management often answers the question, what are the essential elements to the strategic plan? While there are many, I would say that these are five that will be key and critical. And I will spend some time on each, but as well as offer some other perspectives to strategic planning. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these steps now, but know that for sure we're going to spend a number of not a bunch of time on what does it mean to determine strengths and weaknesses, and how to develop alternatives or identify opportunities and threats when setting specific objectives in a strategic plan. But first, I feel like you should know, and this is, I should also say that usually I teach grad students, and this is only the second time that I've taught undergrad, and the second time being teaching this particular course for the Leadership Studies program. But I wanted to still set the context for how we think about organizations, and why it's important for you as students in leadership studies to be able to understand a little bit of the history of organization theory. Much of organizational theory has taken place since the turn of the century. What I'm presenting is a way to understand and organize exploring theories of organization. It has been suggested that there are two underlying dimensions in the evolution of organization theory, and that each dimension in turn has opposed perspectives. The first dimension reflects organizations as systems, and that's prior to about 1960, organization theory tended to be dominated by a closed system perspective. Organizations were seen as essentially autonomous and sealed off from their environment. But around 1960, organization theory began to take on a distinctly open system perspective. So one way to understand organization theory would be via the type of way that organizations were viewed. A similar approach to developing a framework would be via perspectives from the position of theorists. Here, the perspectives would be modernist, symbolic interpretive, and postmodern. The modernist perspective has always been known as the quote-unquote rational perspective, the open systems view, the positivist school, and the quantitative approach. The symbolic interpretive perspective has been known as the qualitative approach and is sometimes equated with the organizational culture school of thought. The postmodern perspective has links to critical organization theory, the labor process school, and radical feminism, as well as the post-structuralist philosophy and literary theory. So while we won't be touching upon all of these, sometimes what I'll be posing are some lovingly provocative questions that you'll be able to tell push upon these many ways of knowing and various perspectives of organization theory. But even before that, I think it's important for us to kind of think about how we think about us. I mean, I think Socrates, who's often considered the midwife of thought, was a proponent of a theory of knowledge that directly contradicted perception-based theory. He believed that knowledge exists within us and needs only to be recovered through correct reasoning. Plato, who was more of the idealist, a student of Socrates, believed that data derive from the senses and are shifting and unreliable as a result of that. He held that true knowledge consists solely of concepts and abstractions arrived at through reasoning. He mocked perception-based theory of knowledge. If each man is the measure of all things, why are not pigs and baboons equally valid measures, since they too perceive, is what Plato put out there. And he even further said that if each man's perception of the world is truth, then any man is as wise as gods, yet no wiser than a fool, and so on. He's big on rational thinking. Aristotle kind of pulled from that, and he was Plato's most distinguished pupil, and he was considered the realist. He contradicted much of what Plato taught, and he was big on empirical data and the love of painstaking observation that's characterized science ever since. Although I feel like he's got a lot of stuff wrong. For example, he thought that mice would die if they drink in the summertime because of what he had observed. And the eels are generated spontaneously because he inferred many things. And that humans have only 8 ribs and that women have fewer teeth than men. And again, that those were rules and theories based on observation. And Spinoza, who was really about ethics, demonstrated in geometrical order deep over the head of most stuff. And then even Hobbes and Locke, who were much more proto-psychologists, didn't view human nature, but instead talked about empiricist epistemology, like how do we actually go and figure out reality. That's I just kind of nerded out on you a little bit, but I wanted to now get over to classical influences of organization theory. And if you search in the origins of organization theory, you'll most likely meet the political economist Adam Smith, who in 1776 published The Wealth of Nations. Smith described techniques of pen manufacturing, and in so doing was the first to record and explain the efficiencies inherent in the division of labor. The division of labor has a lot to do with differentiation of work tasks and the resulting specialization of labor, ideas that are essential to the concept of social structure in organizations now. But even some of the other classical influences include Karl Marx, and he's best known for his theory of capital and related ideas about alienation. In the theory of capital, it's built upon Marx's belief that collective work, or labor, forms the foundation for the social world. Marx argued that capitalism rests upon a fundamental antagonism between the interests of capital, in other words, capitalists, for example, the owners of factories and the means of production, and those of labor, that is, the workers, of whose activities from the core of the production process, who are the core of the production process. Over 100 years after Smith introduced the concept of the division of labor, French sociologist Emile Durkheim wrote his book on the subject. In The Division of Labor and Society, published in 1893, Durkheim extended the concept of the division of labor beyond manufacturing organizations to explain the structural shift from an agricultural to industrial societies that accompanied the Industrial Revolution. Durkheim described this shift in terms of increases in specialization, hierarchy, and the interdependence of work tasks. Early modernist org theorists regarded these concepts as key dimensions for defining and describing complex organizations. So even as I share some of these phrases and terms, I'm sure you'll hear how they've resonated in today's thinking of organizational practices. I wanted to kind of describe quickly some types of theorists, and I sort of alluded to it in the historical analysis. But the first type of theorists are those who I would say are more machine theorists. Frederick Taylor wrote The Principles of Scientific Management, and he marked a serious theory building in the field of management and organizations. He was a mechanical engineer who consulted to Midvale and Bethlehem Steel and came up with his 4 principles of scientific management to significantly increase productivity. That was, he replaced the rule of thumb, those methods for determining each element of a worker's job and scientific determination, scientifically created processes for selecting and training workers, and talked about the cooperation of management and labor to accomplish work objectives in accordance with the scientific method. And then 4, a more equal division of responsibility between managers and workers, with the former doing the planning and the supervising and the latter doing the execution. I'm not going to spend time on all of these others with Fayol and Weber and Davis, except to say, if you're so interested, I'd be happy to talk more about any of these folks, particularly Weber and his study of the ideal bureaucracy. And ideal bureaucracy being not ideal in terms of something to aspire, but ideal in terms of what does it mean to work a structure that's very mechanistic or very machine-like. Oops, sorry about that sound effect. A case example of the machine is that of the goal attainment approach, right? It's here that an organizational effectiveness is appraised in terms of the accomplishment of ends rather than means. So popular criteria include profit maximization, winning the game, and bringing the enemy to surrender. Type 2 theorists are those when they start to introduce the human element to understanding organizations. Mary Parker Foley was an early organizational philosopher who may have been the earliest quote-unquote situationist, who discussed how order should be depersonalized in an organization to unite all concerned in the study of the situation, to discover the law of the situation and obey that law. She argued for a participatory leadership style where employees and employers cooperated to assess the situation and decided what should be done at that moment in that situation. Once the quote-unquote law of the situation is discovered, the employee can issue it to the employer as well as the employer to the employee. For her, it was really about the manner of giving orders and facilitated better attitudes within an organization because nobody is necessarily under another person. So again, it very much was human-oriented. An example of this is the idea of constituent satisfaction. Again, not so much did we just reach our goals, but how did people, humans, feel about our progress and the accomplishment. And so oftentimes criteria was contingent upon the identified critical entities or the significant people who needed to say, yes, that was good, or no, that wasn't good, or this needed to change. Type 3 theorists were those who consider organizations as an organism. And they recognized that it wasn't just about the machine, it wasn't just about the humans, but we needed to give way to a more contingency approach. Herbert Simon, for example, essentially argued that organization theory needed to go beyond superficial and oversimplified principles to a study of conditions under which competing principles were applicable. Katz and Kahn, who I'll share their model of organizational theory a little bit later, were social psychologists studying organizations, and they promoted open systems view. And they examined the importance of relations of an organization to its environment or with its environment, and the need for organizations to adapt to a changing environment if they are to survive. The type 3 example of the systems approach is that it was a focus on specific ends and on the means needed for the achievement of the ends. So again, not just the goal, but what were the processes to achieve that goal? Was that something to study as well? The effort, as well as the effect, as well as the specific outcome. And so effectiveness was judged by its ability to acquire inputs, processes, and the way that process these inputs, and how channeled towards outputs and maintain stability and balance. The type 4 theorists were about status and power. And this is really one of my favorite areas of understanding organization theory. So we'll talk more about power a little bit later, but they also acknowledged, March and Simon in particular, acknowledged that they were challenging the classical notion that organization theory and organizational change was rational. They argue that people as humans had limits to their rationality, actually limits to even just considering all the things that needed to be considered. And so they argued most decision makers select satisfactory alternatives that were just good enough. Nothing was going to be comprehensive and exhaustive, so they needed to just do what was good enough. And then Jeff Pfeffer did a lot of studying organizations as political arenas, really looking at to what extent coalitions were emerging, what happened when inherent conflicts over goals emerged, and the manifestation of organizational design issues that favored self-interest of those in power over those who were constituents or those impacted by the decisions. So really looking at organizations as coalitions composed of varying groups and individuals with different demands. And so example of this type 4 is a competing values approach. The idea that really you need to look at what was in competition, and the criteria explored many times the extent to which an organization could be flexible or be very controlling. At one point are people more important or priority over the organization as a collective? And then the balance between means and ends. There are also related to issues of strategic planning were basic design issues in organizational design. So here is one organizational design model that really takes into consideration business climate, setting the stage, gathering data, designing transformation, implementing and evaluating, and then really the people. I think I look at it as asking questions: how are activities coordinated? Are they differentiated or are they integrated? Who makes decisions? Are we centralized or decentralized? How are employees' activities monitored? Are they standardized or are they allowed to mutually adjust? And then what are the effects of status and power? Is it a formal organization or an informal organization? And we'll talk about many of these questions when we get to the strategic priorities and around the 4th or 5th week. I mentioned Katz and Kahn, and this is a typical understanding of organizational change of input, throughput, and output, where the input are those things that are gained from the environment, resources, as well as the history. And from input to throughput is the strategy. And around the strategy, or around the throughput, is the mission of the organization and the values that are the foundation of the organization, all towards the vision, right? What's the product, the kind of organization or the group or individual outputs that all emerge. But what's beautiful, I think, about this particular model is that there are feedback loops all throughout. So not just feedback from the throughput to the input, but the output to the throughput and output to the input. So what's the relationship between all of that? So it's an ongoing feedback loop. So that's a quick and dirty of organizational theory. And one of the things, I'm going to bring it home a little just to get really, really down to earth. But one of the things I want to incorporate or encourage you to consider is, why are you doing what you're doing? You're going to hear me often say that leadership is taking responsibility for what matters. And while I would encourage you at some point to fill out these thoughts about for whom and what you have love and gratitude, for whom and what you have compassion and commitment. I would offer that this is something that an organization also needs to consider, because the leadership of an organization is taking responsibility for what matters. And to what extent does the organization have compassion and commitment, and what are those things for whom and what they have compassion and commitment? And that will guide the values, guide the work, and guide the accomplishment to the vision. And then, and also, I'd also incorporate this and connect it really to your PLP. Because I assume that what you're doing there and why you're in this program matters. And again, leadership is taking responsibility for what matters. And in this course and in an entire program, really, I'm going to invite you to take a vow to not burn out. I do think leadership is about capacity building. I think it is about strengthening your competencies, but also doing so in a way that's a healthy way. That if you're going through this program and working 24/7 and taking a full load and doing raising a family and or taking care of even parents and elders, that can be a stretch. And that I think sometimes while suffering and challenges are inevitable, we tend to have a surplus of suffering that I think leads to the injustices that exist. And again, I'm going to talk more about my values and practices later, but I wanted to offer this as something that you might consider. Of course, this isn't mandatory, but I would hope that as you take this course with me, that it isn't going to lead you to burnout, and that you would consider practicing self-care, mindfulness, healing, joy, and gratitude. I believe that our capacity to address our toughest social challenges depends on our willingness to admit we are a part of, rather than apart from, the woundedness of our world. So I look forward to chatting with you further. Take a look at the syllabus to look at how to, or actually look at the assignments on the Canvas that suggest what the discussion forum is about around the reading, and that you do have a reflection paper that is actually 2 parts. 10 points will be around completing the questions about why strategic planning, and then another 10 points will be really around what are the goals that you have for the course, what would make this course worthwhile. All right, we'll be in touch. Take care.